Now I'm recording. Thank you, Joy. Somebody was on the ball tonight. All righty. As I said, we're starting off now with the story of Jacob and his sons. They're settled into the land of Canaan. By the way, there are two words in Hebrew, biblical Hebrew especially, that are used when you want to talk about somebody living somewhere. Lagur, to be somewhere, that has a temporary aspect to it. Vayagar, if you dwelled there, it doesn't mean you really settled into the place. Vayeshev, as we have here, is a permanent settlement. It means to settle in. Jacob's making into a permanent yishuv in terms of his being in the land of Canaan. But that's not going to really last very long, as we will see. So right away, we see that certain themes repeat themselves in the Bible, and that is a father making a mess with his sons, screwing up with his children. We had Isaac not recognizing the full nature of Esau versus Jacob, and thus wanting to give the blessing to Esau when Jacob was the one who really was destined for that. And so Jacob, who was the younger son, now turns to giving greater honor to one of his sons, namely Joseph, who was the firstborn son of his favorite wife. And it says he gives him at 17 years of age, Joseph tended the flocks with his brothers as a helper to the sons of his father's wives, Bilhah and Zilpah. And Joseph brought bad reports of them to their father. All right? He's a tattletailer. Now, Israel loved Joseph best of all. By the way, here you see in that short span, we use the name Jacob, Yaakov, and we use the name Yisrael. When we talk about the Bible in general and the documentary hypothesis, I will talk about that a little bit. Anyway, so it says to us directly that Israel loved Joseph best of all of his sons, for he was a child of his old age, and he made him an ketonet pasim, that they translate in this translation, ornamental tunic. This is the magic, the colored, what's the play? The multicolored coat of Broadway fame.
Joseph in the Technicolor Dreamcoat.
That's it. I don't know about psychedelic, but it was certainly a coat of many colors, it says, according to many translations. And it is given to the son who is the dreamer or the interpreter of dreams. Dreams have a very powerful impact in the story of Joseph. The Bible takes dreams very seriously. Jewish tradition takes dreams very seriously. As a matter of fact, we're just studying in the Talmud a passage in which it talks about dreams that if a dream is really bad, you may be wanting to watch out for what it means. And so you may declare a personal fast day in order to avert the evils of that dream. And even if you had a dream Friday night, Shabbos, the next morning, even though it's Shabbat, you are allowed to fast because you want to take care of that dream. So this idea exists throughout biblical Judaism and modern and up until to the modern age. So, but we see in here, Joseph has dreams. Those dreams are of him being the center, being the power, and being a power over his family even. And so, as would be normally the case, the brothers are jealous of him because of the favoritism of their father, and they become more jealous of him as a result of Jacob giving him favorites, making him his favoritism. So that sets the stage for a very powerful story. The rabbis in the Talmud and a lot of the traditional commentaries spend lots of efforts trying to excuse what happens. We're just going to look at it at the basic level, which is his brothers are out tending sheep. All the older brothers, all his brothers except for the youngest brother, Benjamin. Jacob sends Joseph out to check up on them. They see him coming and they plot against him. They when he comes there, Reuven, the oldest, says to the brothers before, they saw him from afar, and before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. They said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let us kill him and throw him into one of the pits, and we can say a savage beast devoured him. We shall see what comes of his dreams." Okay, they talk. We don't know which brother. The brothers are talking back and forth. Let's just get rid of him, toss his body into one of these pits. And, in those days, there were lions roaming around the land of Canaan. There were bears in the land of Canaan. So let's tell the father that's what happened. But when Reuven, the oldest of the brothers, the firstborn, heard of this, he tried to save him from them. So first of all, we see that Reuven is trying, at least to some level, to save his brother Joseph. And he says to them, let's not take his life. Let's not shed blood. Cast him into that pit out in the wilderness, but do not touch him yourselves. And then it says, intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. So here's a plan. Let's put him in the pit. And whenever we go, everybody goes away, I'll go back, I'll pick him up and bring him home. So that's what they do. When Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamental tunic that he was wearing. They took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it. Rashi always, and the rabbis, always sensitive to words and language. Say, you throw him into a pit. Well, if there's water in it, he's going to drown. So obviously there isn't anything in it, right? But it doesn't say there was no water in it. It says the pit was empty. It says the pit was empty. Then it says there was no water in it. So Rashi says and comment, yeah, there was no water, but there were scorpions and snakes. Okay. When you say there's no water, that means the way the rabbis always read things. When you say one thing, by the way, this is a very Jewish thing. You have to be able to use your thumb like this in order to go to the Beit Din. So anyway, so he says, when it says there's no water, that means there must be something else there. Otherwise, he said there's nothing in the pit. The pit was empty. By saying there's no water means no water, but something else. That's how the rabbis interpret in the Bible. And so eventually the brothers go and eat, and Joseph's in the pit. And then what happens is a caravan that comes by. It's not clear who does what exactly, but in some manner or form, Joseph ends up in the hands of these Ishmaelites on their way, and Midianites on their way down to Egypt. And so the brothers will come back and find that Joseph's missing. And so they take the coat that they had stripped him of, they kill a goat, and dip his blood, his garment in it, and then they bring it to their father, Jacob. They didn't lie to him. Where they say, we found this. Please examine it. Is it your son's tunic or not? All right. So they didn't say he died. They didn't say, here's his bloody tunic. Is it Joseph's? And Joseph says, my son's tunic, a savage beast devoured him. Joseph was torn by a beast. Jacob rent his clothes, put sackcloth on his loins, and observed mourning for his son many days. Right, so he's really distraught over the loss of Joseph. And the Midianites on their way down to Egypt sell him to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh, his chief steward. All right. Probably he is his chief steward. I don't like that translation exactly. He was his chief steward. All right. So now we have a break in the action of the Joseph story. We have a story about Judah, and Judah marries a woman named Hira, and he has 3 sons, and he takes a wife for his oldest son, Er, and the name of this wife of Er is Tamar. And so Tamar marries Er, and something goes on. It's not clearly spelled out in the Torah, but in any case, Er dies. And so Judah then turns to Onan, his brother, says, join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law and provide offspring for your brother. This is what we call the levirate marriage, which is the idea that when the Torah prescribes that if a man dies without children, his widow is supposed to marry one of the brothers so that they will have children and his name will live on through those children. Onan doesn't want to get her pregnant, and as it says, knowing that the seed would not count as his, let it go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife so as not to provide offspring for his brother. So I made sure that she could not get pregnant, and so God gets upset with him and takes him off the scene. So now Judah's lost 2 sons, and he's got a 3rd son left. And as a matter of fact, we find in the Talmud and in the Shulchan Aruch, it says if a woman's been married 2 times, you've got to look out, and both husbands die, got to think twice or 3 times about marrying a 3rd husband. All right, so Judah's not so sure that she's not a killing wife. And so he says the 3rd son is too young. Stay in a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. All right, and it says for he thought he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's home, and as time goes by, she's not summoned to marry the other brother, and so she concocts a plot. Judah's wife in the meantime has died. Judah's out taking care of the sheep. She sets herself up on a crossroads, looking like she is a prostitute. The Bible is very straightforward in some of these stories. Judah comes in, and he's without a wife, and so he wants her services, and he gives her a cord and a staff as in lieu of payment. They didn't have credit card services in those days, and goes with her, and then when he goes back to his sheep, he sends his friend with the money, a kid to pay her off with a young goat, and she's not there. He can't find her. Nobody knows who she was and what it was all about. All right, so then 3 months later, she's pregnant with child, and now since in theory she was tied to at least Judah's family, his sons, and maybe even Judah himself, as we see according to the story. In a sense, she's a married woman. And since she's a married woman, she obviously played around, and Judah assumes that she has not prostituted herself, but she has been guilty of adultery. Says she should be burned, which is nowhere else mentioned in the Bible as a punishment for that. But before they take her out to be burned, she says, she doesn't say who got her pregnant, but she says whoever owns, how's the language? She sent this message to her father-in-law: I am with child by the man to whom these belong. And she added, examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these? Judah recognized them and said, she is more in the right than I, inasmuch as I did not give her to my son Shelah, and he was not intimate with her again. So Judah says, yep, she's right. I'm the father. He doesn't tell everybody, but he says, I was the father. She didn't do anything wrong. He's never intimate with her again. And we see here also, as again, often in the Torah throughout the Bible, we have certain elements that pop up in different places. Now, when Joseph is thrown into the pit and the brothers bring the signs that Joseph is dead, they say to their father, you recognize it, you determine it. Tamar doesn't say who the father is. She says, you determine it. So you see that kind of balance between those two stories. In any case, she eventually gives birth to two sons. And first, when it says one of them put out his hand, and the midwife tied a crimson cord on that hand to signify this one came out first. But just then he drew back his hand, and out came his brother. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So who is named Perez, which means a breach. Afterwards, his brother came out, whose hand was the crimson thread, and he was named Zerach. So these two are descendants of Judah. And eventually we will see when we come to the story of Ruth, how they fit into the total scheme of things. So then we get back to Joseph. Joseph sold to Potiphar. Potiphar puts him in, makes him work for him, and he's very successful. God favors everything happens in Potiphar's house because of Joseph. And so, if you're successful, you get promoted. He's promoted to being over charge of everything in the house, except for Potiphar's wife. And she falls for this young man, another bit of soap opera that we have in our stories. And she wants him to lay with her. And he says, no, no, no. And then finally, it says, was it? So one day he came into the house to do his work. Interesting language. A lot of the commentaries say, what do you mean he came in the house to do his work? What work did he have? None of the household being there inside. So was Joseph just going to do what he's supposed to do, or was Joseph going as giving in and deciding to do what he shouldn't do? It's not clear. But she caught hold of him by his garment and said, lie with me. But he left his garment in her hand and got away and fled outside. So once again, we have a garment fitting in with the story of Joseph. It's not the multicolored coat from the psychedelic coat, but it's a different coat. He spurns her. Why? He felt guilty at the last minute, or he never meant to do it. She spurned, cast aspersions on him. She said that, and so she's the wife of the Egyptian. He's the servant, so obviously he's not telling the truth. And Joseph gets thrown into a prison. While he's in the prison, two of Pharaoh's major officials, his butler and his baker, are thrown in for whatever reason, and they each have dreams. Joseph interprets those dreams that the butler will be restored to his position, the chief cupbearer restored to his position, and the baker will be slain, and that happens. And Joseph tells the butler before he goes back, he says, look, remember me that I'm in the prison. I didn't do anything wrong. But of course, we know that people in power forget those who help them out often. And so Joseph is forgotten and left in prison for a while. Okay. So there we have that for today. So we're left with a hanging story. Joseph left in prison. What takes place? Stay tuned. Tune in next week. Before I forget, I'm going to be going out of town next week. I hope to be able to do the class, but if for some reason, after about 15 minutes, you got to give me 15 minutes. If for some reason I don't show up, then obviously I couldn't get it going. I should be able to. My son's got his own computers and everything in his house, and he's got access to the web, and I should be able to do the class. So, but the next time you see me, God willing, next week, I will be broadcasting from the great municipality of Pomona, New York. And if you've never heard of Pomona, New York, it's down the street from Muncie, New York. And if you've never heard of Muncie, you don't know about the Jerusalem of New York. No, it's a very interesting community, a lot of Hasidim in that area. I remember a number of years ago, I went to, there's a huge kosher grocery store. At that time, that was the only one. Now there's an even bigger one. And this was Saturday night, and I'm in my white shirt and dark pants, and I think I just had a black yarmulke on. And I walk in there, and I look like a Gentile because everybody else had the strimals and the kapatas and the fur hats on and everything else. So I look like I was the outsider in that outfit. Okay, so we will see. God willing, we'll do it. Now, also because it's going to be Hanukkah next week, and I want to talk about Hanukkah tonight, we're going to start with Hanukkah. We'll see if we get to the Hebrew at all tonight. And I hope soon to be able to mail out to those who haven't had the opportunity to pick up their books. Maybe the next week or so, I will try to mail them out to you. Okay. Now, first things first, before we tell the story of Hanukkah, we have to understand something very important. Hanukkah is not the Jewish Christmas. There is no connection other than time of year between Hanukkah and Christmas. Hanukkah is not one of the biblical holidays. All the events take place after the time of what the rabbi said was the close of the Bible. The end of the biblical period essentially is around the time when Alexander the Great conquers the Persian Empire. Anything that was in the Bible was said to have been written at least before that time. Modern scholars quibble about some of the books of the Bible, especially Daniel and other things as well, as to whether or not they were written before this time. But at least on the face value, it had to have been written before this time. And the events had to have taken place before the close of the Bible. And Hanukkah, we know when it takes place. We know that it takes place in 164 BCE, okay, before the Common Era. And the book that was, there are two books, two major sources for it, First and Second Maccabees. The two books have nothing to do with each other, but they are the recording of what took place, which is our major information. We may look at some of that, I hope, before the evening's over. But again, they're dated when they are written, so they are dated after the time of Alexander the Great, after the time of the close of the Bible. So therefore, there is no biblical book that would be give it weight to be considered a biblical holiday. And indeed, in the Talmud, it's played down. You know, the major holidays have tractates that are dedicated to them for the most part. Shabbat has a tractate, not to say there's not mentioned other places in the Talmud, but there's one part of the Mishnah, Masechet Shabbat, that deals essentially with Shabbat. Another Sukkot deals with the laws of the Sukkah and the Lulav and Etrog. Rosh Hashanah deals with the shofar blowing and the New Year's celebration, and etc. There is no book, not even a chapter, dedicated to the story of Hanukkah. And the only place it appears in the Mishnah is only because it's talking about when if a camel is walking through the marketplace and he's carrying a load that reaches into a shop that has a Hanukkah light lit, and it starts a fire, who is guilty for the fire? All right, is not talking about the thing. Then again, in the Talmud, when it discusses some of these things and talking about lighting candles for Shabbos, it talks about lighting Hanukkah, lights for Hanukkah, my Hanukkah, what's Hanukkah? It even introduces it, my Hanukkah, what's Hanukkah? What do you mean, what's Hanukkah? Hanukkah is a 7-day holiday. We know what, an 8-day holiday. We know what it is, but the Talmud introduces it by saying my Hanukkah. Very strange. All right. So we'll come back to the Talmudic discussion later, when we talk about the observance of Hanukkah. Right. I will send out to you this outline that I had put together to give us an idea of the historical period. You are supposed to have read what we have in the history of Israel. But around the year 334 BCE, is Alexander the Great attacks the Persian Empire. Around 333 BCE, Judea is conquered. Right? Judea had been conquered by the Babylonians. It had then become a possession of the Persians, of the Persian Empire. As many communities throughout the Middle East, they pretty much were allowed to run their own store, as it were. As long as they paid their taxes and didn't revolt against the Persian Empire, the Persian emperor didn't care much what they did. Right? So now, after Alexander the Great dies, his great empire, which extended from Macedonia, north of Greece, all the way to India, breaks up into three parts. Greece and Asia Minor, that goes to one of the generals. Seleucus, another one of the generals, he takes over Iran, Persia, Mesopotamia, and Syria. And the third, Ptolemy in Egypt, has Egypt, which is actually the most valuable of all the properties. And by the way, of course, Cleopatra of fame is a descendant of Ptolemy. She was not a native Egyptian. She was actually Greek in origin. Okay, so now Syria at that time included Judea. Okay, so Judea at this point is under the control of the Seleucids in Syria. However, a few years later, a couple of decades, 301, Ptolemy grabs hold of Judea and puts it under his rule in Egypt. And again, local affairs are pretty much left to the devices of the local authorities. In this case, the local affairs are run by the high priest and a council of elders, which at least historically is probably the origins of the Sanhedrin. The Jewish community, in the meantime, in Egypt expands, becomes a very influential community over the course of the centuries. It becomes a Greek-speaking community. The Jews in the land of Israel probably mostly spoke Aramaic. The Jews in Egypt adopted Greek. And therefore, many of them could not read Hebrew, could not understand Hebrew. And so the Bible was first translated into Greek for the Jews who live in Egypt at that time. The famous Septuagint was created around that time, the Greek translation of the Torah. It's called the Septuagint because legend has it that Ptolemy asked for 70 elders from Israel to translate the Torah for him. And he put them in 70 different rooms. And all 70 came out with the same exact translation in Greek, even when they had to play around with some words to not mislead, to make so the Greeks wouldn't think the Jews worship more than one God. They all came with the same way of twisting the language a little bit to make it work out. So that's why it is called the Septuagint, the 70. All right, so the Ptolemies have control over Judea for about 100 years, and around 198 BCE, Antiochus Antiochus III, also called the Great, drove the Egyptian forces out of the area. And he continues, though, this Ptolemaic style of overlordship, which was not normal. That was normal for empires. The central authorities couldn't be bothered to take care of everything that's going on locally. As long as you pay your taxes and don't revolt, then everything is okay. And at this time, even before this time, even when the Ptolemies were there, if you look at the history of the world, I know colonization is a big wording these days. All people colonize throughout the world. Well, let's take India, for example. In India, English, after the British came, English became an important language of India. English mores became important. Cricket, a typical English sport, all of a sudden becomes a big sport in India. And the high-ranking people, the wealthy, the rulers and local rulership in India side with the British for the most part, because that's where they can maintain their power, adopt British ways in many ways, and you create that kind of culture. Well, the same thing happens in Judea during the time of the Ptolemaic and the Seleucid rule over the land of Israel. Many of the upper classes, the priestly classes, the rich, emulated Greek ways. After all, if they're the power, there must be something about them that gives them that ability to be the power. So their language, their culture, all of that attracts people. And so we begin to have the creation of what is called Hellenism. Now, Hellenism is an amalgam of Greek religion and culture, along with native cultures of the Middle East. So every region had their version of Hellenism. In Judea, it was mixed with some of the Jewish influences. So the Greek language, fashion, some religious practices, education curriculum, all had their effect on the locals. Philosophy and athletics became an important part of the life of the culture. And as I said, some Jews, including amongst the priests, adapted and identified with this culture. Now, some aspects were innocent enough, the adoption of Greek names. As a matter of fact, many of the rabbis that we read about during this period had Greek names, or a little later on had Greek names. And in some of the burial chambers in Beit She'arim, where we known as the Sanhedrin's burial, even during the 2nd century of the Common Era, some of the rabbis' caskets there had Greek inscriptions on them. Sometimes Hebrew, but also Greek. Now, one of the areas that, for example, it becomes problematic, and and this is mentioned in the books of the Maccabees, was the introduction of the Greek athletic games. Now, what's the big deal? Well, the games, the participants in these games, first of all, was limited to men. Only men could watch the games, and only men participated in the games. Any females there were not females of honor in any way. The men waged the contest in the nude. Right? They were naked. Right? Now, big deal. If you don't care, Greeks were very enamored with the beauty of the body, but Jewish athletes participating in the games were very identifiable because they were circumcised. Right? Therefore, for some, the idea that they had been circumcised became a problem. And we're told that they underwent very difficult, painful surgery in their day to try and mask the fact that they had been circumcised. That's how much they wanted to be with everybody else. And in the modern world, we see that again in some of the push that we have in some Jewish quarters to eliminate circumcision from Jewish tradition. But so these pressures are there, and it goes through the whole, runs through this whole period of time. Now, in the year 175 through the year 163 BCE is where the Hanukkah story finds its place. Antiochus IV, called Epiphanes, has problems that he has to deal with politically. Amongst them was the fact that Rome was expanding, becoming a power in the world. He was afraid that Egypt, which eventually did, of course, falls to the Romans, and he wants to head off the Romans. You know, wars take money. So where can you get money? Well, you borrow money. You can also sometimes find places to raid. You hit the banks. Now, the ancient world, temples, holy places, were often places where people deposited their wealth for safekeeping. And so where do you go to rob? Why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. Why did he pilfer from temples? Not just the Jewish temple, but others, because they had the money. So he plundered various places of worship of the various communities, including the temple in Jerusalem. Now, another issue was taxes. You know, today we all, every year, once a year, we fill out our tax forms. If we have withholding from our wages, they're withheld during the course of the year. The government says, all right, send me all your money that you're supposed to send me. End of story. Unless, of course, you don't, in which case you got problems. But they didn't have that kind of a tax system. What was a very prominent tax system in much of the ancient world is called by the nice name of tax farming. An individual or group of people would get together and they would pay the taxes for the locality, the province or the city, whatever that area was, political boundaries. And then they were allowed to recoup what they paid in taxes plus a profit. So you can see how that can cause all kinds of friction. Who gets to farm the taxes? The person or persons who promised the highest returns to the emperor. And the one who, the higher they promise to pay off, the more money they have to raise locally in order to make a profit. Now, the leadership in the Jewish community at this time, we said, came from the rich and most especially from the priestly class. And so it was amongst the priestly class that this becomes an issue. And the high priest, the role of the high priest becomes a bargaining chip in this competition of taxes. Candidate A says, I will give you X amount of money if you appoint me the high priest for the Jews. Candidate B says, no, I will give you the money, right? And so the person who gets elected to being high priest is not necessarily the gentleman that everybody thinks is a nice guy and he's very pious and he's very observant of all the rules and regulations of the temple. No, it's the guy who pays off the highest bribe. So it's recorded that there was a man by the name of Jason who bribed Antiochus to appoint him high priest. And he raised funds for Antiochus through tax farming. And the legitimate high priest was ousted and he flees to Egypt. Soon Ananias is his name. He established a temple in Leontopolis, which is the only temple we know about that was ever erected to the one God outside of Israel. But they did not have animal sacrifices there. Apparently they had only meal offerings. Furthermore, under Jason, a gymnasium is established in Jerusalem, where the games would take place and following Greek custom. Now along comes a man by the name of Menelaus. He becomes high priest in bribery. He sells off some of the temple implements. He helps Antiochus plunder the temple and stripping the gold leaf from the temple facade. So the locals are not really happy with this, and there are riots that break out. And Antiochus, as a result, partially destroys Jerusalem. Now, what follows is not clear 100% the order which takes place. I'm going to give you the traditional Jewish religious understanding of it. Some scholars put in a slightly different order. But after this minor revolt, Antiochus, as I said, partially destroys Jerusalem. Self-rule under the Torah is abrogated. Torah scrolls are burned. Circumcision, Sabbath, and festivals are banned. So there is an attempt to wipe out the distinctiveness of the Judeans, to make them fully Greeks or Hellenes. And in 167 BCE, in December, the temple in Jerusalem is turned into a pagan temple. Pigs are offered on the altar, and Antiochus demanded that he be worshipped as a god. And of course, now rebellion breaks out. There are really two different groups that are involved in the rebellion. One group is called the Hasidim, the pietists. These essentially were Jews of all kinds, all stripes. They just wanted to be left alone to practice their Judaism as they saw fit. The other group were called the Maccabees, which we really don't know where the name comes from. Also called Hasmoneans, the son of Mattathias. And the revolt breaks out, and there's number of battles, guerrilla warfare. Eventually, by the year 164 BCE, they're able to enter into Jerusalem, restore the temple, and establish Hanukkah. Now, even though they conquered the city of Jerusalem, there is a place called the Citadel. The Citadel is this tower that overlooks the temple. It's a fortress. It remained in Greek hands, and those Jews who sided with the Greeks held up there as well. And as we look over the whole story, we see that really in many ways, this was a civil war as well, because those Jews who wanted to Hellenize they sided with the Greek overlords, and they fought with them on their side. And we have this information. Some of this, as I said, we find in the books of the Maccabees. Let me find that. Okay. So in the first chapter of the book of Maccabees, we read that in the 15th day of the month of Kislev, Kislev is this month that Hanukkah falls. It's also usually falls during December. In the 145th year, they set up the abomination of desolation upon the altar and built idol altars throughout the cities of Judah on every side. They burnt incense at the doors of their houses and the streets. And when they had rent in pieces the books of the law which they found, they burnt them with fire. And whoever was found with any book of the testament or any committed to the law, the king's command was they should be put to death. All right, so on the 5th and 20th day of the month, 25th of Kislev, they did sacrifice upon the idol altar, which was upon the altar of God, at which time, according to commandment, they put to death certain women that had caused their children to be circumcised. All right, so some of the women had their children circumcised, and so what did the authorities do? They hanged the infants about these women's necks and slew them or threw them off the walls and what have you. Albeit many in Israel were fully resolved and confronted themselves not to eat any unclean thing, wherefore they would rather die than not be defiled with this non-kosher meat. All right, so then we're told a little bit later, in those days, Mattathias, the son of John, the son of Shimon, the priest of the sons of Yarib from Jerusalem, dwelt in Modim. And he has 5 sons. I'm going to give you the Hebrew version. This is from the King James translation. Yochanan, called Kaddish, Shimon, called Tasi, Judah, who was called Maccabeus, Eleazar, called Avaran, and Yonatan, whose surname was Aphus. And when he saw the blasphemies that were committed in Judah and Jerusalem, he said, woe is me, wherefore I was born to see this misery of my people and of the holy city, and to dwell there, when it was delivered into the hands of the enemy, the sanctuary into the hands of the strangers. So what happens is, we're told that an officer is sent to the town where Mattathias lives. He wants them to worship on an altar in the city of Modin to the Greek gods. One of the local people go to do it, and Mattathias kills him, pulls down the altar, and they begin their revolt. So after a few chapters later, then said Judah to his brethren, behold, our enemies are discomfited. Let us go up to cleanse and dedicate the sanctuary. Upon this, all the hosts assembled themselves together and went up unto Mount Zion. And when they saw the sanctuary desolate and the altar profaned and the gates burned up and shrubs growing in the courts as in a forest or in one of the mountains, yea, the priest's chambers pulled down, they rent their clothes and made great lamentation, cast ashes upon their heads, and fell down flat to the ground upon their faces and blew an alarm with the trumpets and cried toward heaven. Then Judah appointed certain men to fight against those that were in the citadel until he had cleansed the sanctuary. So he chose priests of blameless conversation, such as had pleasure in the law, who cleansed the sanctuary and bore out the defiled stones into an unclean place. And when they had consulted what to do with the altar of burnt offerings, which was profane, they thought it best to pull it down, lest it should be a reproach to them because the heathen had defiled it. Wherefore they pulled it down and laid up the stones in the mountain of the temple in a convenient place until there should come a prophet to show them what should be done with them. That's interesting. There are no prophets at that time. And so they said, we don't know what to do with these rocks, the former altar. We'll have to wait for a prophet to come along and tell us what we should do with it. Then they took whole stones according to law and built a new altar according to the former, and made up the sanctuary and the things that were in the temple and hallowed the courts. They made also new holy vessels, and into the temple they brought the candlestick and the altar of burnt offerings and an incense and the table. And upon the altar they burned incense, and the lamps that were upon the candlestick they lighted, they might give light in the temple. Furthermore, they set the loaves on the table and spread out the veils and finished all the works which they had begun to make. Now, in the 25th day of the 9th month, which is the month Kislev, in the 148th year, this means from the time of Alexander the Great, they rose up in the morning and offered sacrifice according to law upon the new altar burnt offerings which they had made. Look at what time and day the heathen profaned it, even that it was dedicated with songs, citherns, and harps and cymbals. Then all the people fell on their faces, worshiping and praising God of heaven, who had given them good success. And so they kept the dedication, Chanukhat HaMizbeach, from which word Hanukkah comes. They kept the dedication of the altar 8 days and offered burnt offerings with gladness and sacrificed the sacrifice, deliverance, and praise. A little later on it says, moreover, Judah and his brethren with the whole congregation ordained that the days of the dedication of the altar should be kept in their season from year to year by the space of 8 days from the 25th day of the month of Kislev with mirth and gladness. Okay. Now, elsewhere, another spot talks about the fact that they dedicated the temple or rededicated the temple for 8 days, because when King Solomon built his temple, we're told that it was dedicated for 8 days. We're also told elsewhere that that year they were unable to celebrate the holiday of Sukkot, and the biblical holiday of Sukkot, with Shmini Atzeret, is a total of 8 days. What you may notice that is missing is anything about the oil. It says they lit the lamps and they celebrated for 8 days. The story of the miracle of the oil is only found in the Talmud. In the Talmud, when they say, my Hanukkah, what's Hanukkah all about? My Hanukkah, they explain that when they rededicated the temple, it came time to light the the menorah. Lo and behold, they could only find one canister, one small container of oil that had not been profaned, that was still sealed with the seal of the high priest or the kosher high priest. And so, what are you going to do? They filled the lamps and lit them, used up. All right, no, they used the oil to fill them up and they lit them. And lo and behold, for the 8 days it took for fresh oil to be prepared and brought to Jerusalem, the flames burned in the menorah day and night. So that was the miracle of Hanukkah. Okay. Now, there's a big discussion. What did they actually do? Did they put all the oil in it? They burned for 8 days and nights with all the oil? Or each time they put in oil, they discovered there's still oil in the container and that lasted for 8 days, what have you. But this story is not found in either books of the Maccabees. It's not mentioned by Josephus, although most of his information is taken from the books of the Maccabees. It's only found in this quote in the Talmud, which is from much later on. Now, we don't know, we can't know, but most modern historians are of the following opinion. When we look at the story of Hanukkah, the 8th day of dedication was exactly how it's described in Maccabees. They dedicated for 8 days. They restored everything. They celebrated for 8 days years later, throughout the years. At some point in time, as the rabbis became more and more influential in the Jewish people, there becomes an animosity between the rabbis and the last of the Hasmonean family before they're wiped out by Herod the Great, and a certain degree of animosity between the rabbis and the priests, because the priests mostly were Sadducees, and the rabbis are the Pharisees at that time, as Josephus describes the different groups amongst the Judeans of his age, amongst the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Zealots, and Essenes, and the ordinary people. And so the last thing the rabbis wanted to do was to celebrate the military victories of the Hasmoneans, since they didn't particularly care for them. Furthermore, by the time the Mishnah is compiled around the year 200 of the Common Era, the Jewish people had gone through 3 terrible revolts. The ones that are most well known is the revolt that ends up with the destruction of the temple in the year 70 of the Common Era, and then the Bar Kokhba revolt, which takes place around the year 135 of the Common Era. Both of them were horribly destructive of the Jews of the land of Israel. Many were shipped off as slaves to Rome and other parts. Many were killed. It was a very bitter and difficult time. And so when the Mishnah is compiled around the year 200, the rabbis want to play down any kind of military ideas of revolt, referencing the Maccabees. Look, they won against this power that was not expected to win against, and therefore, the last thing the rabbis of that generation wanted was to give any kind of push to once again revolt against Rome. And therefore they downplayed Hanukkah, but it was so popular in the imagination of people that they did not eliminate it entirely, but they changed the thrust of it from the military victory to emphasize the religious victory. And indeed, even we see this happening already even in the book of Maccabees, because in the book of Maccabees, we are told about some of this, the martyrdom that took place during that time. So it says, so example, in chapter 6 of 2nd Maccabees, Eleazar, one of the principal scribes, an aged man and of a well-favored countenance, was constrained to open his mouth and to eat swine's flesh. But he, choosing rather to die gloriously than to live stained with such an abomination, spit it forth and came of his own accord to the torment. As behooved them to come that are resolute to stand out against such things as are not lawful for love of life to be tasted. But they that had charge of that wicked feast, for the old acquaintance they had with the man, taking him aside, besought him to bring flesh of his own provision. I pretend, bring something else, and and pretend to eat the pig, and he wouldn't do it. He didn't want to do that kind of thing. Then in chapter 7, we're told the story of Hannah and her 7 sons. It came to pass also that 7 brothers with their mother were taken, and compelled by the king against the law to taste swine's flesh, and were tormented with scourges and whips. But one of them spoke first and said thus, what would you ask of, or learn of us? We are ready to die rather than to transgress the laws of our fathers. Then the king, being in a rage, commanded pans and cauldrons made hot, which forthwith being heated, he commanded to cut out the tongue of him that spoke first, and to cut off the utmost parts of his body, the rest of his brethren and his mother looking on. Now when he was thus maimed in all his members, he commanded him yet alive to be brought to the fire and to be fried in the pan. And as the vapor of the pan was for a good space dispersed, they exhorted one another with the mother to die manfully, saying thus, the Lord God looketh upon us, and in truth has comforted us, as Moses in his song, which witnessed to their faces, declared, saying, and he shall be comforted in his servants. So when the first was dead after this number, they brought the second to make him a mocking stock. And when they pulled off the skin of his head with the hair, they asked him, will you eat before you will be punished throughout every member of your body? He answered in his own language and said, no. Wherefore he also received the next torment in order as the former did. Then when in his last gasp he said, thou like a fury takest us out of this present life. The King of the world shall raise us up, who have died for his laws unto everlasting life. And so it goes through each one of the sons, the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth. And it says then the sixth. But the mother is marvelous above all and worthy of honorable memory, for when she saw her 7 sons slain in the space of one day, she bare it with good courage because of the hope that she had in the Lord. Yea, she exhorted every one of them in their own language, filled with courageous spirits, and stirring up her womanish thoughts with manly stomach, she said to them, I cannot tell how you came into my womb, for I neither gave you breath nor life, neither was it I that formed the members of every one of you. But doubtless the creator of the world, who formed the generation of man and found out the beginnings of all things, will also of his own mercy give you breath and life again, as ye now regard not as your own selves for his law's sake. Now Antiochus, thinking himself despised and suspecting it to be a reproachful speech, whilst the youngest was yet alive, did not only exhort him by words, but also assured him with oaths that he would make him both a rich and happy man if he would turn from the laws of his fathers, and that he would also take him for his friend and trust him with his affairs. But when the young man would in no case hearken unto him, the king called his mother and exhorted her that she counsel the young man to save his life. But when he had exhorted her with many words, she promised him that she would counsel her son. But she, bowing herself toward him, laughing the cruel tyrant to scorn, spoke in her country language in this manner. O my son, have pity upon me that bare thee 9 months in my womb and gave thee such 3 years and nourished thee and brought thee up into this age and endured the troubles of education. But I beseech you, my son, look into heaven and earth and all therein and consider that God made all of them, etc., and, don't do it. Right? So we have in the Maccabees this idea of religious martyrdom, which becomes obviously an important element in later Christian theology, and also we find that in medieval Ashkenazic teachings. So the rabbis emphasize, though, the religious aspect of it. And we know, I mentioned earlier that there were what we call the Maccabees and their followers, and there were the Hasidim, the pious ones. After the initial victories, the Hasidim left off the war. They were no longer interested. Once Jerusalem was in Jewish hands, they didn't care anymore. Slowly but surely, the brothers who eventually are killed off for the most part, until Jonathan finally, in the last end of it, more or less gets freedom from Antiochus, the Syrian rule, and has an independent Judean state for a few generations. And so the Maccabees, the Hasmoneans, were in it for not only for religious reasons, but for political reasons. And we know that in the end, they fell victim to the same Hellenizing influences that they had actually revolted against. So getting back to the Talmud story, so the Talmud says, since this miracle took place, we're going to celebrate Hanukkah 8 days. And the basic mitzvah is to light each person in their household a light each night of Hanukkah. Night 1, you have a special lamp to proclaim the miracle of Hanukkah. Night 2, you have a special lamp to proclaim the miracle of Hanukkah. Night 3, you have a special lamp. Night 4, in other words, each night of Hanukkah, you light one lamp. Now, we have the very strange language, because then it says Mahadran, better than that, if you want to really do a nice job, each and every member of the household lights a lamp. So if you got 5 people in the house, first night of Hanukkah, there are 5 lamps. Second night of Hanukkah, there are 5 lamps. The third night of Hanukkah, there are 5 lamps, etc. Then it goes on to say, Mahadrim and a Mahadrim, you really want to do it. All right, there's a difference of opinion between Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai. I'll give Beit Hillel's approach, which is what we followed. First night of Hanukkah, you light 1 light. Second night of Hanukkah, you light 2, 3, 4, until the 8th night of Hanukkah, you have 8 lights burning. The school of Shammai said, no, you start with 8 lights for the first night, and each night you have fewer. And of course, we obviously followed the school of Hillel to add an extra one. Now, the Chanukiah, that's, by the way, word menorah means a lamp. A lamp, a menorah can be one lamp, it can be a dozen lamps, doesn't matter. The menorah that we refer to for Hanukkah to distinguish it is called a Chanukiah. The Chanukiah is traditionally a 9-branch candelabra or oil lamp. One of the 9 is set different from the others, either higher or off to the side. It's called the shamash. Why do we do that? Because we're also told, the rabbi said, the miracle of Hanukkah is such that we light the lamps for one purpose only, pirsuma nisa, to proclaim, to advertise the miracle of Hanukkah. And we have no permission to make use of those lights for any purpose whatsoever. We're not allowed to read by them, to use them to see by. So now, if you have light burning all by itself, it's almost impossible not to make some kind of use of it. So the tradition was you light a second light called the shamash, and that is the light that you use. Now, there are other lights that might be there you ignore. If you need some light, you're relying on that one lamp. And so that's why it's distinguished by putting it either higher than the other lamps or put off to the side. Often it's in the middle, higher than the others. Okay. So now, how do we light the Chanukiah? The first night of Hanukkah, we have our shamash, and then as we're facing the lamp, we put a candle or we put the oil container to the right-hand side of the Chanukiah, where your right hand would go to it, the far right of the Chanukiah. And then you light the shamash. You say the 3 blessings on the first night. The first one is Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, praise the Lord God, King Universe. Asher Kiddushanu Mitzvotav V'tzivanu Lahadlik Ner Shel Chanukah, who is sanctified by his commandments and commanded us to light the Hanukkah lamp. Then you say Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, praise the Lord our God, King of the Universe. Sha'asa nisim lavotenu bayamim ahim bazman hazeh, performed miracles for our ancestors in that day and time at this season. The first night, we had a third blessing, the Shechianu, the one we say at the first night of every holiday. Baruch Atah Hashem Elokeinu Melech Haolam, praise the Lord our God, King of the Universe. Shechianu v'kimanu v'giyanu lazman hazeh, kept us in life, sustained us, enabled us to reach this milestone or this occasion. Then you light the lamp. First night, you only have one light to light, you light that one. Second night, you have, starting from the far right, you have one candle. Immediate to its left is a second candle, a second lamp. Okay, so you have 2 candles, one by each other. This is my right hand. I know everything looks backwards, but anyway, all right. My right hand, we have 2 candles. This is the far right. Okay, this is more to the left. So after I say the brachot, I light the newest candle first, the one furthest to the left, and work my way to the right. The third night, I had a candle, again, to the left of the other 2. Then I light that one first, that one second, that one third. Fourth night, fifth night, etc. All right, so we start on the right, put candles in going from the right, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever number it is. But we light from the left, from the newest candle going to the right. And then there's a paragraph that we say after that, that basically, if you can do it, read it in English, it says, we're lighting these lamps to proclaim the miracle of Hanukkah, and we don't have permission to make use of them. And some people sing Ma'oz Sur after that as well. Now, originally, this was done outside the house. You were told in the Talmud you would do it at your front door, and you would have the mezuzah on the right-hand side, and I have to talk about the mezuzah, I almost forgot. The mezuzah on the right-hand side of the door, Your Hanukkah on the left-hand side of the door. So as you walk in the house, you're surrounded by mitzvot, the mezuzah and the Hanukkah. Most people light indoors. If you and since the idea is supposed to be a publicizing it, if you're lighting indoors, you should light it near a window that people can see from the outside. If you have a house, you're in a house, the ground floor, front of the house is the ideal place to do it. If you're in an apartment building, and what have you, and you're way up, nobody can see it, then put it in the place in the room or your living room where everybody's going to be gathered. Okay? So that's number one. Number two, the candles are supposed to be lit after it's dark. Okay? It really should not be done until after the sunset, about 42 minutes after sunset. And the candles have to burn for at least half an hour. Now, that's no problem on Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night. No big deal. Friday night is Shabbos. What are you gonna do with Shabbos and the Hanukkah and all of those good things and the Rabbi Shuckling? Yes, yes. Okay. I had to, why not? Got to keep you entertained. So what we do is, one, we take care of the Hanukkah first. Ideally, we don't light it in the same place that we light our candles for Shabbos. Okay. Then we do the Shabbos candles. Now, remember I said it's supposed to burn for a half an hour. It's supposed to burn for half an hour after it's dark. It doesn't start getting dark until about 40, we say traditionally 42 minutes after sunset. So now we have a total of 72 minutes that it has to burn. Furthermore, you have to light it before you light the Shabbos candles. And the Shabbos candles have to be lit 18 minutes before sunset. So now we've got an hour and a half, the candles, a little more than an hour and a half that the candles have to burn. And those little candles you buy in the boxes, the little boxes, you're lucky if they burn half an hour. So for on Friday night, if you have used just little candles, you should purchase enough bigger candles that will last for close to the 2 hours. Over 90 minutes. If you don't want to do that every night, that's fine. But on Friday night, when it has to burn a long time, yeah, you should do that. And Saturday night, we do it after Havdalah. Another custom is that in the synagogue, they light the menorah. That doesn't fulfill anybody's mitzvah. The mitzvah is still incumbent upon you to light the Hanukkah at your own home. Okay? And in synagogues, we light it at night, and we also light it again in the morning. That's the tradition before we daven in the synagogue service in the morning. There's special prayers that are added for Hanukkah. It's not a day of rest. You can work on Hanukkah. It's also not a day that you have to give gifts. Nowhere was it written that Hanukkah is a gift-giving holiday. The giving of gifts was influenced by the presence of Christmas. And when you compare Hanukkah to Christmas, it's not very good comparison. Hanukkah's nice, it's fun, but it's no big deal. Christmas, my God, but the tinsel and the trees and the lights and the Santa Clauses and this and that and the gifts and all of that stuff, which we'll talk about another time. I think what happened was Jews kind of felt a little self-conscious and they wanted their kids not to feel so bad. And so giving gifts, you get a gift on Christmas. I get 8 gifts, one each night, one better than the other, until I got a whole household of gifts. All right, man. But that's really what happened. We do know that you're not supposed to be working or doing things when the Hanukkah is burning, at least for the half hour that it burns. And certainly in medieval Europe, they had to do something during that time. And so they played a game with a top. It's a little a gambling game, a dreidel. Called it a dreidel. The dreidel is Yiddish. And the dreidel was a four-sided top. And each side of the top had a letter on it. Nun, Gimel, Hey, Shin, which we understood to mean Nes Gadol Haya Sham. A great miracle happened there. So, of course, in Israel, since there is here, instead of a shin at the end, Sham, they have a pay for po here. However, the truth of the matter is the letters meant something else. In Yiddish, the nun was for nisht. If everybody antes up a coin or a nut or whatever you're playing for, and you take turns spinning the dreidel. And if it lands with the nun on top, it means nish, nothing. You get nothing. If it lands with the gimel on top, ganz, you get it all. If it lands with a hey on top, halb, you get half. And if it lands with the shin on top, shoop, you got to put one in. That's what it originally came from. Potato latkes are famous on Hanukkah. Well, the Maccabees did not know from potatoes. Potatoes came from the Americas. They were not a European delicacy until much later on in history. And yes, they are full of oil. And so that's the explanation given is, as the holiday celebrates the oil, the olive oil that was used in the Hanukkah. So we eat potatoes fried in lots of oil so that we get lots of oil around the house. There's also the famous battle. Is it latkes, potato pancakes, or is it sufganiot, donuts, filled donuts, jelly donuts, also known as Bismarcks in some parts of the world? Right? That became a custom, especially in the Middle East, was the jelly donuts. They all come into being much later on in history. Right? But the basic idea is to celebrate. And there's a very big message here. I'm going to end Hanukkah with that, then I will talk about the mezuzah, and then we'll call it a night because I'm running out of steam. I started off by saying how really in some ways it was a civil war. The Jews of Judea of the time of the rulers, when the Greeks ruled that part of the world, they were confronted with how you maintain your identity, your belief system, your culture in the face of other cultures, especially when it's a more dominating culture. How do you go about deciding where to go? And I say every Jew, no matter what flavor they are, can be found on a kind of a measuring rod, some on this end, some on that. Some say, you know what, the culture around me, whether it be Greek or Roman or Canadian, that's the ideal. And anything in Judaism that can fit into that culture, that's what I will do. That's my Judaism. My Judaism is what looks good to the Canadians. The other side of the spectrum are those Jews who say Judaism is all that there is. There's nothing but Judaism, nothing but Torah. Everything else is external, meaningless. And I'm going to make that my measuring stick. If there's anything in the outside culture that can be acceptable to Judaism, all right. I can have a computer with the Talmud on it. Yeah, that works nicely. But I don't have to adopt any kind of Canadian lifestyles or culture. Between those two extremes is the rest of us. All of us try to find a balance between the outside world, the culture around us, and the ideals and directions of Judaism, of Torah and mitzvot. Some of us are closer to one side, some are closer to the other. But that's what the challenge of living life is, and that's what Hanukkah talks about. Hanukkah talks about that struggle to find the balance between your Judaism and your external culture. And every one of us has to make that decision on their own. How we go about doing it, how we make that balance between the two. And different people are going to have different effects in different places. Tomorrow is the American Thanksgiving. I grew up in the United States. I lived there for 3/4 of my life. I think still 3/4. I'll do the math later. And Thanksgiving in the States was very popular in most Jewish circles. Most synagogues took recognition of American Thanksgiving. They celebrate, they have their turkey dinners. We usually do it here in Canada on Friday night, but otherwise we have our turkey. Because it's a very nice holiday. It says you thank God for the good things in life. Thanksgiving, that's a very Jewish concept. Now, there were some who were opposed to that. And here in Canada, there were two factors that were going on. One, of course, is, as I say, the later generation, the Jews came to Canada at a later date. Plus, the Canadian Thanksgiving falls right around Sukkot. The last thing we really need is another big meal during Sukkot. We've been having all the yontif meals. We've been eating enough. We may have been eating turkey. So in Canada, for whatever reason, the Canadian Thanksgiving never caught on very much. It's not, and that's not really a statement of Jewish separatism. I think it's just a reality of the calendar. Had Thanksgiving fallen like the American one, plus American Thanksgiving has this whole mythology with it of the pilgrims and everything there. And even if you're not a pilgrim, you can kind of grab onto some of that mythological idea. There's no mythology here in Canada for Thanksgiving. I'm not even sure what the story is, why there's the Canadian Thanksgiving, other than it's a nice thing for Canadians to give thanks as well. Okay. So that's important. Now, I didn't have enough time to completely finish on the mezuzah last week. I just wanted to touch upon a couple of things about the mezuzah. Right? The mezuzah is, the essence of the mezuzah is the parchment. In the container that is outside that people usually refer to as mezuzah is secondary. You can have some places still even today, people put a notch into the door frame and put the mezuzah into that notch, that niche or whatever you call it, all right, dug out part and cover it over. That's the mezuzah. Most people, though, will put in some kind of a case that is then nailed attached to the doorpost. And you can have simple plastic one, you can have fancy schmancy gold ones, you can have everything in between. The Torah says, "Uchavtam al mezuzot beitecha." You shall inscribe that on the doorposts of your house. Now that means a plural. So the mitzvah is not simply to put it on the front door to your apartment or to your house. It really is to put it on every doorway that has a full doorway, lintel across the top and clear doorposts on the side, that goes into any space that's a reasonable size space that is coveted, a nice place to be in. You don't do it in the bathroom. If you have a walk-in closet, it really should be, a big walk-in closet should be on the door of the walk-in closet. Always on the right-hand side of the door as you're entering into the room. Front door, right-hand side of the front door. Back door of the house, or you have a back door to your domicile, on the right hand of the door as you're walking in. If you have a doorway leading in further into the house, let's say you have a hallway with doors. Well, then it's on the right-hand side as you're coming in. If you have off to the right of your entryway, there's a living room. So the right-hand side of that doorway leading into the living room. All right, so it's right as you go in. So generally speaking, that solves that problem. Also, there was an argument as to how you attach the mezuzah. Do you attach it straight up, vertical, or do you attach it like this, horizontal? Yeah, so we compromise. We put it at an angle. So it's neither up nor down. When you're only halfway up, you're neither up nor down. All right. And so the top is going into the room. So the right-hand side of the doors, you're going into the room, entering into the house, entering into a room is the place where it should be attached. All right. And you should really check them every so often to make sure they don't weather out, especially the ones on the outside of the house, that moisture and everything doesn't get in and to ruin them. Okay, any questions? Everybody's going to send me lots and lots of Hanukkah presents? No, you don't. Please don't. But enjoy Hanukkah. And we will see each other. Let's see, Sunday night's the first night. Second night is Monday. Third night, fourth night of Hanukkah, God willing. Okay. And if we do get together, hopefully we will do the Hebrew that was supposed to be for tonight. So I suggest everybody have either a glass of grape juice or a glass of wine handy. Okay. For the lesson next week. Yeah. It's not going to be that bad. Yeah. Just a little. Well, you have, I don't know, some of you may take a big drink before you start the class. I don't know. I'm a bourbon man myself, but I usually avoid before class. Okay, good night, everybody. Have a good one.
Good night.
Good night.
Good night, Rabbi.
Good night.
Night.